All right, recorder's going. This may be all we get. That's fine. I saw some students taking their exams downstairs, and there was a countdown clock. So maybe when that expires, 0 to all run up here and join us. I felt sympathetic for them because I don't remember seeing the countdown clock so blatantly presented on the front screen like they're dealing with on the first floor. This is my dissertation defense, Redefining the Homeless Experience in Michigan. I have 20 slides, planning about 2 minutes per slide, 40 minutes total. There's one pause for questions if you'd like to ask them at that time. The way I divided it up in half was chapters 1 through 4, background of the problem, history, and methodology, and then there's a split into my data and the good stuff. So if you want to ask questions about the first half, feel free to do that at the halfway point, or if you want to just save them to them, that's fine as well. There are 3 links to the slide deck, the proposal, and the dissertation. There, all the stuff's available. The bibliographies in the dissertation, so I don't cite them too in depth on the slideshow. The PowerPoint templates for Michigan State. The images, the pictures are all mine, unless it's an icon, then it's from open clip art, and I use that with permission. They're shareable. So this, the first picture here shows two passersby not paying attention to the beggar there. And it kind of sets the stage for why I'm doing this research, which is the existence of a social problem and the perspective that the public, some of the legislators, and some of the just general civilians have is a little bit different than maybe the reality is. So I wanted to get at more what the real life experience of the homeless individuals was. And so that's why I did my stuff. The table of contents for my dissertation are these 8 chapters, the basic chapters of intro, background, theory, methods. Then chapters 5 through 7 is me conducting the methods and gathering data and looking for themes. And the conclusion's rather brief. 2 pictures here from a college town. I saw that same crate last week, and last time I saw the guy that holds that sign was about 3 weeks ago. So even though this is a 3-year-long study, I still see some of the participants. And some things have changed and some haven't. Some have received housing and some are still in the same places as they were 3 years ago. Introduction chapter, we start with this pretty clear quantitative fact that homelessness is dropping. In 2007, it was counted 651,000 homeless individuals, and in 2014 there was 578,000 homeless individuals. It's been constantly dropping, except for an uptick in 2010. And so if it's dropping, and if communities like Washtenaw County are saying that they've solved homelessness and we're at functional 0, why should we even look at it as a problem? I hear news stories in Utah that they're solving the problem, they're housing everyone. And so they can say that homelessness is dropping, they being the agencies, the nonprofits, governmental institutions, the media, and they can count the dropping homeless rates, but that doesn't really encompass the entire problem. The poverty is increasing, inequality is growing. Some graphs and charts that I show in the dissertation to support this in chapter 1. Also, there's some misunderstanding about the lives of the homeless and the lives of beggars. Sometimes beggars aren't homeless, sometimes homeless don't beg. In fact, I read a news story today in The Guardian about New York City, and New York City has the highest number of homeless, concentrated homeless individuals in the nation. And the stat in the article today from The Guardian was 30% of the homeless in New York City are employed. So 30% of the homeless in New York City have jobs. So there's a misunderstanding that these are lazy, non-working individuals. And there are laws that harm these individuals. I'm assuming that the 30% meant real jobs, if you consider leaving fast food a real job, or legitimate legal work. So that's 30%. I'm assuming that there are individuals in New York City like there are where I did research in Detroit who are scrapping, begging, prostitution, drug sales. So I would consider those to be working individuals, which would make the 30% even higher. In other words, not necessarily real lazy people out there. The laws that harm those individuals are laws against scrapping, laws against begging, public nuisance, anti-loitering, and anti-squatting laws. So I argue in the introduction that we need to go further than a quantitative explanation, and we need to understand more about the lives and these other factors here. In chapter 1, I talk about 3 sensitizing questions. I don't start with hypotheses and try to support or negate them, especially with quantitative data. I don't do that. These sensitizing questions are normal for qualitative research. They guide the research as opposed to providing a platform to prove or disprove. So I start with these 3. How do the structural forces contribute to the variability of homeless experiences? Because homeless experiences did vary quite a bit in my study. What are the coping strategies? Which also relates to question 1, structures that influence the variability in coping strategies. And number 3, how is the homeless identity socially constructed? I did that last as I emailed Toby earlier this week. I did that 3rd question. I was intending to get more into the surveying the public and interviewing the public, civilians and citizens, about their views of homeless people and how they construct the identity of homeless individuals. There's a little bit of that in the Can-Man portion, and I did one survey. I would have liked to go more in depth on that. So my socially constructed identity research includes that, but it's not as much of the public understanding as I would like. I build a lot of my social construction of identity that response to that question more through my ethnography and my actual participation in the group in interviews with the homeless themselves. So they, in fact, contribute to the construction of their social identity. And I talk a little bit about described versus enacted identities in the dissertation. Just a side note, this is not so scientific, but I thought it was interesting that I talk about sensitizing questions that guide the research and tell me where to look. And I didn't intend to do this, but then I put this picture up here, and it was my picture where they're not looking at the homeless individual. It's almost like he's an invisible character here. And so the sensitizing questions that guide me where to look, you know, it could guide those people where to look too. That's just a side note I thought was coincidental in my use of this picture. Chapter 2, background of the problem. I did research in Michigan mostly as a convenience sample. I did research in a heterogeneous city, meaning government, industry, and academia in that city, and a college town, predominantly a college town, and also a deindustrialized large city in Michigan, mostly because that's where I worked and went to school and spent my free time on weekends. So there's a lot of convenience built into that sample, but there are 3 main factors that I convey here about the uniqueness of Michigan. And the climate varies quite a bit. So when I would see a tent city in the summer, it would be different than seeing the same tent city in the winter. The coping strategies of seeking shelter maybe in a warming center versus sleeping outside. There's a variability of climate, which a place like Los Angeles doesn't have as much. There's a starkly variable economy. The difference between a place like Detroit and Ann Arbor is quite a bit different. There's another slide that's going to mention some of the ways that it's different, just basically. And also, Michigan political landscape is it's not totally unique, but it's unique in the fact that if you look at the districts and you see all the Republican legislators in more rural areas, and then you have the concentrated Democrat urban legislators. And then what I found was when I look at an anti-squatting bill, the anti-squatting bill would be proposed by a suburban legislator. There's not too much squatting in the suburbs as there would be in Detroit. So the anti-squatting legislation may come out of legislators who represent a constituency of the slumlords and the landowners, which then would harm the constituency in Detroit who votes against anti-squatting bills, which are the areas where the actual squatters live. And so you see that play out in Michigan time and time again with the way that the districts are rural and urban. And it's frustrating to see, for example, an anti-squatting bill come out of a rural county or be supported by a rural legislator as if that has real impact on their district. But other ways that Republican legislators have affected the homeless community is at the bottom. Engler closed all the, well, not all of them, but most of the psychiatric hospitals in the late 90s. So the brief history of homelessness, I didn't do too much antebellum stuff. Prior to the Civil War, I just didn't go into detail there. I started looking at homelessness after the Civil War because, in my view, that's where it started to get what you might call the current phenomenon of homelessness. After the Civil War, you have freed slaves and vagrant soldiers, vagrant soldier camps. This is, in fact, where the term hobo might actually come from, although nobody knows the specific place it came from. If you have, like, ho boys, and you shorten it to hobo, or if you have homeward bound, some soldier that's going back to his home, he's homeward bound. If you shorten both of those phrases, you could get hobo. So after the Civil War, you had the freed slaves and the soldiers in their camps. And then after the Civil War, the railroads were built, the depots were built around Lansing, for example, right around the turn of the century. At that time, the economies in places like Bay City and Flint were trading posts or logging communities, and that's where Skid Row comes from. A logging community would have a road where the logs skidded down, so they used to be called Skid Road, the skidding being the logs skidding. Bay City had a Hell's Half Mile. So homeless people at that time were more train riding from logging camp to logging camp seeking work. At the turn of the century in Detroit, for example, you have a lot of charities and across the state, county poorhouses springing up. Then the Great Depression makes everyone poor. After the Great Depression, New Deal, Fair Housing Act, things like that, work becomes available, housing is more available, so you could work or be housed if you wanted to. The hobos and tramps and rail riders at that time, we might consider that more by choice. Choosing to work a certain way from town to town, transportation a certain way, riding the rails. But then in Detroit especially, in the 1960s, we have systemic urban renewal where highways mostly displace residents. And there's a slide, I think it's the next slide, that's going to show that pretty clearly how that affected extremely poor people. It didn't necessarily create the phenomenon of homelessness, but it did not help entire communities. It really destroyed, literally, entire communities. And so not all of those community members instantly became homeless. Some of them did. But to impact a community so negatively like that, I would argue has long-lasting effects. In the 1980s, you have winos of the 60s and 70s turning into more recession-era, out-of-work guys. There's some pictures in the dissertation that show that. And then at the end of the 90s, that's when the psychiatric hospitals closed. And the guy who closed them is actually now the director of community health, I think. So he's still doing his work. So that hasn't gone away. So the point with that especially is also with the rest of these points, none of these things really went away. I mean, the logging lumber town of Bay City, the economy has changed there. It's more of a down place. But these things, the impact of urban renewal has not gone away. And the impact of closing the psychiatric hospitals has not gone away. So there's a historical context that's still relevant to it. So this is a map that's not in the dissertation, but the list of these charities is. It's, I think, in page 87. What I did was map out these charities that existed in downtown Detroit in 1904 to give a little bit of a visual representation of the displacement and the movement of homeless services. In 1904, there were literally dozens of charities downtown. One of the sad things is anytime I do a street view of these, it's either an office building, an abandoned building, or a casino. And then in 1904, Skid Row in Detroit was Michigan Avenue. Michigan Avenue here intersects with Trumbull. The Old Tiger Stadium is right here. If you know anything about Detroit, this will give you context. And so in 1904, you had all these charities that served the poor, and you had Skid Row here. You did not have any of the highways. In 1960s, the highways came in, and so did the, not in the 60s, but soon thereafter, the casinos came in. Comerica Park was built. This area has been revitalized, or however you want to frame it. So what you see here are the charities, and then in a very unscientific map here, I just Google searched homeless services and homeless shelters. And here they are here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's one over here. You can, I mean, it's really clear that these homeless charities in Skid Row here has been shifted, especially due to the construction and the highways. A little north, a little northwest, and then Skid Row now in Detroit is more up here at about 2nd Avenue and Martin Luther King. So it's going even farther north. So there's a real shifting landscape in this urban center of Detroit, not only where the charities are and the number of charities, but also Skid Row, and a lot of that has to do with the effect of 1960s urban renewal. Chapter 3 was theory and literature. I don't necessarily try to prove or disprove a theory, and I don't, as I've said, really have hypotheses, but I base my research on certain major components in the research and the prior literature. Tally's Corner, for example, will talk about how the lives of these individuals who are on the street and the passersby, the truck offers them work and they decline work. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are overall declining work or that they're unemployed. They might have other jobs, night jobs. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're homeless, even if they're congregating on the street. So there's some mixed identities there, differences between perception and reality. Harper describes strategies that extremely poor people and homeless people in trance utilize. For example, going into a social service agency and lying about one's employment. And that's a coping mechanism to navigate and deal with bureaucracies and get the best outcome out of the situation. Harper talks about that. Merton says that individuals not properly oriented to society become fictional, and this reminds me of the invisible homeless phrase or theme that's been present in the media recently. And then Parsons talks about how individuals relate to their situations. There's other theorists in the dissertation and in my slide notes like Du Bois and Goffman, but this just provides more of a groundwork and a foundation of how I move forward with my research. This influenced me to perform qualitative methodology. I started with a grounded theory, as many of you know, which was my can-man study. Initially, I wanted to analyze the microeconomy of the can collectors on the college campus of Michigan State. Here we had a hegemonic system where you have the privileged tailgaters and the low-income, legitimate, but not necessarily formally working can collectors. Everyone seemed to like the system, so I wanted to study what that was, who that was benefiting, and that sort of thing. So I started with the can collection study. I found out that a lot of the can collectors were homeless, number one, that a lot of them were not homeless, number two, but the tailgaters seem to describe the identity of bum and homeless to almost all of them. So they look at all the tailgaters look at all the can collectors as homeless bums. Maybe half of them were, half of them weren't. And those who were, I wanted to learn more about their lives. So that's when I pursued ethnography in a homeless shelter. I did embedded participation where I stayed for 5 or 6 weekends in a homeless shelter. As you know from reading, I'm actually on the rolls. I participated as an actual resident. I got to know some of the residents, various pseudonyms, and some of the workers. I gained access through a gatekeeper, specifically one administrator who I talked to, and he prepared me for how to get into the shelter and what to do and how to navigate. So I participated as a homeless individual, even though, to be quite clear, I was not a homeless individual, so I cannot say that I have a full understanding of that mentality mindset. But I participated as fully as I could, and it really did affect my mental state while I was participating in a way that I didn't expect. I also observed, you know, I was there, I looked at people's behavior, I took pictures. My visual ethnographic data, which I can't emphasize enough, is not journalistic storytelling, it's used as data in the dissertation. And I based that approach and that method off of these three tenets from, let's see, Gold, Becker, and Harper, specifically these three. The sample of behavior has to be actual real behavior. It can't be a response to a researcher. It has to be not just a one-time thing. It has to be repeated. So the pictures that I present are, I have numerous pictures from numerous places and venues that sort of say the same thing in the picture. So I'll put one-ups for efficiency. And adequate measures to ensure sensitivity. This is from Steve Gould's literature. Many of the pictures here you'll see don't even have individuals in them. And the individuals that are in these pictures, actually all but, I think, one is not presented with a pseudonym. There's only one individual that has a pseudonym who's actually in the picture. So in other words, nobody will be able to see a picture and then try to figure out who that is as a pseudonym. There's a lot of sensitivity to separate the pictures from the other data that's in the dissertation. I continually coded throughout the research. I used deduce. There's not frequency tables like I talked about in my proposal defense, because as many times as I would do a frequency table and recode, it would line up with my sensitizing questions and my concepts, but the frequency tables didn't really add anything to the dissertation. I thought the arguments I made with the data that's in the dissertation, I felt was sufficient to get my point across. And any frequency table that I tried to create, I was doing it after the fact, and I just didn't feel it supported it in the way that I wanted to. So I left those out. I still have the data in deduce, and some frequency tables are still there. But it was more the processing of the data throughout the entire 3 years that helped influence my sensitizing questions and answers. And I thought that was more appropriate than including frequency tables and other metrics from deduce. So I developed the themes from the data and not from hypotheses. And I have emergent theory and themes that stem out of the data as is appropriate in grounded theory, rather than trying to improve or disprove theories and start with existing theories. I used qualitative and ecological methodology. This is important for a variety of reasons. Qualitatively, for example, this is pretty simple. We could count the number of beds and the number of shelters, and we could say, here are the shelters, here are the homeless people. Well, there's a problem with that. Number one, you could say shelter, what the shelter's really like, some of them don't even. In 2 counties, as is stated in the dissertation. I participated in the Detroit count, in which we did not count any homeless people. I went back the next day and week and saw 40 or 50 at the soup kitchen. And so I can say quite emphatically, the count methodology is flawed. So I'm really upset with the count methodology, the accuracy of the quantitative data, and the sort of vague, generalized, uniform, one description of maybe a shelter, when I learned really quickly that the difference between a Christian mission and a government-run shelter in a tent city are starkly different. So when someone says that a person is housed, that means a lot of different things. Also, as I said many times, the identities are incorrect. That some beggars are not homeless, vice versa. This is a picture of a Detroit Skid Row warming center. Here there are no beds, and individuals come sit in chairs, and this would be how they sleep. there's one TV up here, and it's a lot darker than that. And it's interesting, taught me a lot. I talk about it in the dissertation. So this is the first part of the dissertation, in other words, the first half. The next half is going to be my data. I talked with Dr. Miller about additional sensitizing questions that I could ask or that I might want to pursue. This one is about the historical context, and then this one is more about the ecological sort of slant that my research has. So at this time, does anyone have any questions or comments about the first half of the research?
And I'll talk about it more. It's not something I think you need to have. I was surprised there wasn't more Goffman in there, because you were talking about Goffman's social constructionism, and then there wasn't any, typifications or any. It was just, it was mentioned, but then not. Was that by design? Did you find that this concept was good, but his work wasn't?
It was not by design. It was more, I started with Goffman. And then when, for example, I looked at the categorizations, and I just started to realize that there's no single identity. There's not even a way to categorize identities. And I just never was able to put them into types and categories. And so even though I started that way, it was just like my frequency tables with the deuce. It just never got to the point where I could say, here's a typology or some type of model. I never got there. So I don't know if that negates Goffman's theory. I don't think it does.
We can talk about it later too. So I was just curious.
Yeah.
More on the problem statement. What little I know of homelessness from different exposures, including Pacific Northwest, is many will argue that the image of a homeless person as an older adult living on your own may also be in error. A lot of homeless children, a lot of homeless families. Now, that doesn't mean you have to study all the types, but it seems to me the image you're presenting, at least for your dissertation, is more the former, not the latter. But am I correct or incorrect?
You're correct, and there's a reason for that. Mostly it's a limitation. As a participant, I participated in a way that I could, and that came to me. In other words, I found my shelter through social contacts, and I lived my experience as a 30-however-old guy. I went to children and women's shelter here in Lansing. It's incredibly guarded. There's security cameras, and they didn't even really want me to communicate with those at-risk individuals. I talked to some women in Detroit. They're older, single women. They're easier to access. And I saw some couples and some women at the shelter that I was at. But I never really had access to children. And so if I would just say my participant experience excluded children because of who I am.
But do you ever talk about how, your work, that's fine, your work is about this homeless experience and not about that homeless experience?
The way I convey it is not sort of it's this and not that, it's that it's this, and there are innumerable thises.
Good, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's, in fact,
That's good. Good answer.
anything else at this point? Okay, so here's my data. Chapter 5. Start with the can collecting study. Some of the themes that came out of the can collection study were tools and teams. And this is not just exclusive to the can collectors, but I have several photos of tent cities and tools, crates with hammers and nails and stuff like that, and clocks and kitchen utensils and storage in the tent cities. So these individuals are coping with the experience of extreme poverty by utilizing tools available to them, even when they have to borrow carts from the grocery store. Teams were more effective in the can collection because you could have someone guard your cans and other individuals could pool their resources. This also was the same in a tent city, for example, or when there was cliques that formed in shelters. So these are not exclusive to the can collectors. It's sort of the stuff that I saw at the beginning. The distinction of the individual lone wolves versus those who participated in cliques, teams, and those who used tools and those who didn't use tools, and what effect that had on the number of cans they collected or how successful they were in their tent living or in their shelter situation. Identities, didn't do too much in the homeless realm, started a little bit in the tailgater or can man realm, and I just had a lot of comments from tailgaters that form the identity of the can collectors as homeless, or those who bums, or those who have made bad decisions. There was a distinction made by a police officer who I spoke to who said you have two types, those who come here that just try to get $5 for a bottle of booze, and those who are trying to come here and maximize profits. And so there was a lot of distinctions between differences in can collectors. There wasn't one real can collector identity, and some of their actual real life experience support these assumptions by the public, and some of them negate them. It was just all a wide variety of comments like this and different types of identities. Oh, there was also, and this is in the dissertation, can collectors who utilize children. So there's a difference between, say, this guy versus families. And I have comments from tailgaters who, and can collectors, that would specifically say something like, you shouldn't bring your kids out here, or something like that. Or other comments that said, it's good that they bring their kids out here because it teaches them work ethic. There are varying strategies for homeless, most of them based on structures. This is a tent city that was washed out by a river flood. And I wondered, especially after sleeping in the shelter, why someone would sleep in a tent city as opposed to a shelter, because the shelter I stayed at was probably one of the nicest in the state. And the shelter itself was not too bad. Sleeping on the floor is bad, but it wasn't unbearable. So I wondered why someone would sleep out in harsh conditions when they had a warm shelter available. And I talked to one guy who was in the suburbs of Detroit who slept in his car. Individuals can sleep in their car in the suburbs because they're more protected by the police and it's a safer environment. You can't really sleep in your car in Detroit because you could be killed at any time. So there's that. He slept in his car, it was safe. He did not like the shelter. He mentioned that in the shelter there's a lot of conflict. It's amazing what's done in shelters, and people are just bullies. You're talking about individuals who have spent 20 or 25 years in maximum security prison. They get out and they go to the shelter. I didn't meet anyone who spent that long a time, but I had at least one subject at the shelter that I stayed at who had come off about a 5 or 7 year bid and was in the shelter. And then I did a search of sex offenders, and there were a lot of sex offenders in the shelter as well. I'm assuming they probably had spent some time in prison. So it's different in the shelter. We might think of it as a safe place of refuge, but really you're sleeping next to somebody that just got out of prison, perhaps for murder, or attempted murder. And that person might have conflict with someone else in the shelter that might not even involve you, and there's danger there. So choosing to sleep alone in a tent is somewhat safer in certain situations, as is sleeping in a car. So this is the very.
I think in either some data I've seen from LA or maybe the Snow and Anderson stuff, that people that live in shelters have worse health. You know, they spread diseases in there and other kinds of things. Or maybe, you know, people that are already sick, they have to rely on the shelter. I don't know what the causal relationship is, but there's a lot of, you know, things that's kind of like people that can survive outside have a higher, you know, agency or quality of life. Also, depending on where you are, there's kind of more, like you can't party, you know, or use substances or whatever and the hours are restricted in the shelter, whereas if you're out, you know, it's more of a party atmosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's actually data in there that talks about see if I can remember all the things that came to mind. Number one, yeah, I had to blow a breathalyzer every night. And so the guys that want to get drunk don't live in the shelter. And that was actually tough for me because I like to drink. And so if I was up to this situation, I might choose the tent lifestyle. So there's that. At the shelter in Detroit, HIV/AIDS, very prevalent. So that's a very impactful health risk there. So if a lot of them have, and there's statistics, even I think some of them are anecdotal from the shelter staff, but if you're sleeping next to someone or sharing needles or whatever, HIV/AIDS is there. And then another thing is at the shelter 2 or 3 slides ago from Detroit, as I talk about in the dissertation, there's no beds. And these women, when I talk to them, they just would tell me about, number one, the depression. There's no windows, they sit there all day. And number two, their legs. And she said, feel my legs. And it was tough. I mean, it was rock hard. And she said it felt like it was gonna break. And she said that her health was just going off the rails, absolutely. Yeah, and then of course you have institutional food. So you could choose with limits. Your diet, if you're in a tent, you can't choose your diet if you're just being served whatever, high in carbs, high in calories at the shelter. So yeah, definitely. The differences between Detroit and the suburbs are pretty stark. So I interviewed and observed people in these areas, so I wanted to see what their economies were like. These are just some basic. This chart is not in the dissertation. It's new, and I don't think this is in the dissertation, but I think this is. So Detroit is obviously starkly different than the rest of Michigan. You have almost half the households in Detroit living basically below poverty, and that's compared to about a quarter of Michigan, so about twice as many. Which, as I said earlier, makes the suburbs a little bit safer of a place, and there's a better police presence in the suburbs. As I talk about in the dissertation, the police actually talk to and work with the homeless and the car sleepers in the suburbs. Whereas Detroit, I asked them, why don't you go sleep in a park? And they would talk to me about the dangers. The unemployment rates in Ann Arbor, if you're homeless, there are help wanted signs all over the place. Subjects talk to me about, well, you can't get hired if you have a felony record and stuff like that. So there are barriers, definitely, but there's not a barrier of this almost 8 times higher unemployment. So this chart shows the percentage of households living at these certain rates. In Michigan, it's the blue line, and this is less than $10,000. So in Detroit, you have 20-some% of households with incomes of less than $10,000. And then you see the crossover here. Detroit has less rich people. Michigan, there has more percentage and proportion. So, I mean, this is sort of stuff that we already know, but it was even more than I expected, especially with the unemployment rate. I mean, because when you get down to a 3.3 unemployment rate, that's the functional zero unemployment rate. More differences in Detroit and the suburbs would be the way that people navigate the institutions. In the suburbs, if you live in Tent City, it's not too far from the shelter. The shelter is not too far from the park where you can beg. It's not too far from downtown. It's not too far from business and economic activity. But in Detroit, there's such high concentrated danger and poverty that the stories I heard were unlike anything that I heard from the suburbs. In the suburbs out here, I lived in Texas and things were tough. I took a train up here. It's a little bit nicer in this town. People are nice to me. The shelter's decent. I mean, people didn't love it, but it was accommodating. In Detroit, I heard stories like, my husband raped me, threatened to kill me. That was at 2 a.m. There was no place else to go because the shelter that was in the earlier picture on Skid Row is the only 24-hour shelter in the area. So they just run there, and then 3, 4, 5 months later, they're still sleeping in those chairs upright and their legs are rock hard. So there was no other option. They went to the only available option that they knew, and I would ask them, well, why didn't you, after a couple of weeks, go to Ann Arbor? Or why didn't you look here? Why didn't you look there? And they didn't know about any place else, and also they didn't feel that they had the resources to get there. And there were some real specific ways that they did not have access there in the dissertation. You know, another story was the difference in Detroit are the backgrounds or the histories. Guys telling me that they would see, I came from a drug family, 2 of my brothers died, 1 from alcohol, and then 1 of my brothers got shot in half. And that's not a story that I heard in the suburbs or in smaller towns. And so I'm assuming there's some post-traumatic stress there, probably undiagnosed. And also it reminded me of the difference between somebody who has bad luck, a lot of this would be the 1980s homeless individual, versus somebody who, and in my dissertation, it talks about the grandmother who is carrying her baby around, I guess there's a family, her baby in a stroller, and the grandma, and they live in a tent. And the mother, which is the in-between generation, was shot in Detroit and now has strokes. She's going to be in poor health the rest of her life. So I'm just thinking about the baby being raised in that situation, or this situation, or growing up and living in this situation. It's a lot different than somebody who's an alcoholic who, or comes off a prison bid or something like that. And I heard more of these types of dramatic stories in Detroit. Really didn't hear any real dramatic stories in the suburbs. And the only one I did hear was that one about her daughter. And so she was a transplant from Detroit to another town. As an embedded participant, I saw differences in the suburbs and the smaller towns. Begging in Detroit is going to be on highly trafficked areas like 8 Mile and Woodward and off the highways and stuff like this. Obviously in Flint too, people will post up begging off the highways. In the smaller towns, you'll get begging. Well, you see them here, I'm assuming, by Frandor, which is close proximity to their tent city. In Ann Arbor, you'll see the beggars in the downtown strip. So begging is available where there are shopping districts or traffic. Begging is not available on Detroit Skid Row. Sleeping rough, you can sleep rough in the suburbs. It depends on the safety. You can't really sleep rough, as my respondents told me, in Detroit because of the dangers. Concentrated living. If you live in Tent City in Lansing, you may actually be totally autonomous or hang with about a half dozen people, and you might spend your days in this city, which is relatively vibrant and decent, East Lansing and Lansing. But if you live in Detroit on Skid Row, you're surrounded by 150 other HIV, heroin, meth, crack, hand billers, prostitutes. I mean, that doesn't describe everyone. That's not their identity, but that is a big concentration of who's down there. And so there's a difference between who's around you, and the concentrated living varies by location. The work differs. In Detroit, you got scrappers and hand billers. In Ann Arbor, Lansing, East Lansing areas, you're gonna have a lot of begging, newspaper, street paper sellers. And the place to hang out depends on seating, electrical outlets, and freedom from hassle, as I mentioned in the dissertation. And this is my picture that shows the sidewalk. This is a park where a lot of homeless individuals congregate, but the sidewalk's only shoveled for the pedestrians. It's not shoveled up to the benches for the homeless to sit. So this is just one example. This is another pretty blatant example of how the homeless have to deal with structural changes, which this guy in this bench, I saw week after week after week, people sitting on that bench, in this case sleeping, and then one day, the bench was gone, so his place to sleep was just removed. I don't see why it was taken down.
Where is that?
This is Ann Arbor. Right across from Michigan Theater. Right in the downtown shopping district.
In a lot of parts of the country, they have specially designed benches that you can't lie on. You know, they don't have a backrest, or they have a folding section or something on them, so you can sit there, but you can't really sleep there.
Yeah, these ones have handrests.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the ones that you could lay down. this guy carries a lot of his belongings with him. There are places, I would call them public lockers. I show them a lot in the dissertation of pictures about where the homeless can store their belongings. Another thing about this guy that you don't see that was common to a lot of people that would walk around are the 2 liters of Faygo pop, so they would carry around that with them. Carrying your belongings as opposed to leaving them prevents theft. There are multiple uses for the belongings. You can use them as pillows. Dressing in layers is important. Even if you live in the shelter, the shelter will kick you out at 8 o'clock in the morning. You have to deal with that until lunch or check-in at 9. So you need to dress in layers and be flexible and adaptable to changes, either in the weather or when they rip out your benches. This is a little chart that was also in my proposal defense, talking about just rethinking homelessness instead of what the public might see a homeless individual and make a lot of individualistic assumptions or project their own life history onto that person and think that they have made bad choices or something. But that's counterproductive. I recommend that we look at the structural forces through these specific things, the circumstance of extreme poverty, lacking upward mobility. Really, there's nothing for them to work up towards, as I said in my proposal defense. If they get housing, they make less than $10,000, so it's not like they're making a big jump. And then the experience of being homeless is a set of coping strategies dealing with the circumstances that produces their being, their identity, which then is perceived in public instead of thinking first and foremost about the structural forces that create the situations. So that's how I think that it needs to be redefined, I guess is the title. Conclusion, more things to think about. This is almost the last couple pages. I just add to the discussion to reject positivism, start with grounded theory, and empathic, the Weber stuff, and then empathic and reflexive approaches. This is not necessarily contradictory to structural functionalism, in my view, and arguments I make. So those things could be built off of one another. But this is more generalized for future research, future thought, and of course my pictures exemplifying that. 1939 and 2014, some things are still the same. And I really believe that's because the approaches are the same. So if we take a different approach, we probably have different results. So that concludes the presentation. Of course, thank the committee members. Each one of my committee members specifically helped me in a very specific way. In my head, you might not all know it, but I really appreciate my committee so much. And of course, first and foremost, all my subjects and my support. Jamie, thanks for coming. And, it was a very, very good experience that taught me a lot. And that's what I was here to do, was learn about it. And hopefully the presentation and dissertation were substantive enough to actually make a change and not just offer a story. So that's it. That's my approach. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from the audience?
Thanks, Red.
I've got a few. I made comments, well, mainly just kind of editorial stuff, so you can have this back and just flip through page by page. The comments are more just kind of what if or something. Well, one of the things I was thinking, I didn't write down here, but as I was reading this was, Marx saw a lot of poverty and homelessness and so on and so forth, and you mentioned it that, it seems to be that, hundreds of years later, we're doing the same thing. So just what's your take on it? Does sociology have a place in this beyond studying it? I mean, what can we offer to say, wait a minute?
Yeah, and that's funny to say that. So one of the updates here on page IV is two quotes from Marx.
No.
Because I think it's really why homelessness is not going to be solved, and until the system changes overall. As the chart from the proposal defense showed, there's a stratified 5 segments of the economy in America. And the quote, I think on that page, says something like, the man who uses his own time for himself robs the capitalist. So in other words, if he's not working, he's robbing the capitalist. And these homeless individuals are autonomous and they're not working, so they're not contributing to the system, and therefore they're penalized. And as long as we have that system, they'll continue to be penalized. And I mean, that sums it up. That's my response.
Right when we walked here, Ray was telling Carl something about how Goldman Sachs is going to come up with some system for developing education or redirecting education, so that it's, I mean, the whole STEM kind of thing and so forth. It's like, you have to learn something that's beneficial to the capital system.
Sure.
Or don't worry about your own ideas or values or.
Well, it was in relation to college.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry.
No.
But, and yeah, again, this can just be free flowing.
First, very good. I think that's very good. The bigger question, and they're probably different. One of the things is when we were talking about Detroit, and you look at where you are in Flint. Ann Arbor is interesting because that's a premier college town.
I think it's supposed to have the highest real estate in the Midwest.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah. Well, Bill Ford Jr. lives in the vicinity, so I think.
And the governor and
Dig it, So I guess one of the things that I see that I think things have been I feel very tense over the last the Obama presidency, the economy changing. As Ray was saying, what Steve was talking about is that my generation was very much believed that going to college would improve your lot. And I think that even if you didn't do really well, I'm not knocking teachers, but the safety net was public education is employment. And even the factories, if you had from here, if you were out of labor industrial relations, you could go into management and General Motors in Flint. That was where I'm going with this is that now I guess I would differ somewhat in relation with that the statement about with Marx and you serve no purpose to the capitalism. I'm more along the line of Darwin. That, the species that adapts the most. I think Engler, Clinton, the politicians, and others do not understand. I don't think a lot of sociologists understand the adaptability of those who are, quote, homeless or struggling. That they adapt. It's not the lifestyle that you and I would want. They're not adapting. They have adapted. I mean, they're much better at it than. Along that line, their social mores and value system is very different from the mainstream. So a lot of us will say, "Oh my God," and in the Black community in particular. So the other thing that connects to me is, so how much of this do you see going back to slavery, or better yet, a lot of the slaves had no skills, or they were not able to cope without a home. Because I said, I just left a discussion yesterday about Detroit, and it was very brutal one. It was related to the riot. So the cause of the riot, so was that a riot or was that a rebellion? My family was coming out of church on that Sunday. It was on a Sunday that it happened. We were coming to church. There were many of us who were wondering, what the hell is this? And so as I become older and we get to study, then you found a whole population of people that were disconnected. I don't know if they were even disconnected. my argument is, were they ever connected? That's were they ever connected? And in that, I think you could go to different sections of the United States, Appalachians in the South. I think the thing that turned Bobby Kennedy, Marian Wright Elementals, turned Bobby Kennedy, the Mississippi Delta. And so it wasn't just poor blacks, it was poor whites. How much do you think is, what you're calling, what is homeless? How much do you think, is there any connection to the post-civil, post-slavery? Because somewhere you had that, I was reading somewhere, you talked about, didn't talk about that, but you did talk about afterwards, the free slaves. Steve does a job in his work when you're talking about, it was funny, not joke funny, but it was funny when Steve was looking for work in his book in Detroit of legitimate businesses. And he wasn't surprised. This was during, you looked at everything. You looked at the Coleman years, you also looked at the Kilpatrick years. Black businesses just, who was it that said that? It was a federal judge, Vikings, said that you got to give 50 years for the blacks to catch on. He caught hell for it. The reality that he probably is generous.
There was that article about you that was looking at the Moynihan Report.
Yeah.
Different contexts.
Yeah, so I'm saying, how much is this is race playing a role, and maybe not race, but certain aspects? Because other folks have come in and East Indians have come in and taken the parking lots. And
It won't blow up.
Good.
Well, I think that it's the multiple disruptions that continue to occur. And so when you have a great migration of freed slaves to Detroit, for example, or to Flint, I've actually talked to some who are descendants of this freed slaves in Flint through some of my past work. Then there is a disruption with the Great Depression. Then there is a disruption with urban renewal. Then there is a displacement from Black Bottom into the projects. And then the projects are torn down. And then they're displaced into a different region, which is just that northwest side of 2nd Avenue and MLK. So it's not necessarily a sort of straight line trajectory from slavery to exactly now. Like this person had this person, and their son is now homeless or something. But the community repeatedly disrupted every 20 years. There's no time to recuperate, regenerate, improve without just getting the next hatchet right in the community. So that's my response.
Yeah, that's 12th Street, really where they moved from. They tore Black Bottom to urban renewal. Yeah, I would just say. Well, what about law enforcement? What is the role of law enforcement in this?
Well, the differences I saw was Detroit and the suburbs. The differences, and I talked to a police officer here in East Lansing. And so the differences are, in Lansing, there's a police presence in the women and children shelter just west of Cedar. They have a little mini station in there. And the director told me this is so they can congregate. This will have, the residents will be less scared of police, and there can be sort of a buddy familiarity. And when I talked to the police officer who I know here in East Lansing, he knows where they are, he looks after them. And in the suburbs, the car sleeper that I talked to, he said police come and they protect them, and they knock on their window, and they see how they're doing. So there's a lot of support from the police in Lansing, East Lansing, and the suburbs of Detroit. I didn't see any of that in Detroit. And so everyone who I talked to seemed to have a positive view of the caretaking of the police in places other than Detroit. I just never heard of Detroit.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that certainly hasn't been my experience with the police in the suburbs, depending on who the homeless is.
Oh, yeah.
They're black, or some Latinos. They're not very nice in the suburbs. Because a lot of them are ex-Detroit cops. They're chiefs.
So the one I talked to was black, but an older guy in the suburbs who slept in his car. Do you think that probably the place and sleeping in his car was different. Maybe, are you talking more about rough sleepers or squatters or something like that, or just?
Yeah, I see what you know. I was just wondering because I looked at the benches in Ann Arbor. I look at East Lansing. You know, my wife's a cop, and so I would agree with you. You know, here that even when we teach, well, a lot of times the students leave their cans, and the guys come in. I know them. They're so bad here, and when I say bad, I mean they're territorial. You know, like I'm Carl and Berkey Hall's mines and Toby Camp. They argue, and the police a lot of times have to end up being a referee. So, okay, Toby, you got to stay over there. This is Carl's. And I got to the point that I would tell my students, all right, cool, leave your cans. It's okay. Because the guy would almost come in sometimes. One guy I had, I was, look, Taylor, classes, you're going overtime. I need to get these because he had a schedule that he was getting cans. So it's a different experience. And so I was just wondering, I think that, you know, it's complex. I was just wondering, when I was looking at your pictures and I was reading and how we treat the homeless, I'm talking we as a society. But I was just wondering what to do. Because I think Detroit police is so screwed up politically.
I think too, you know, I talk about that suburb and that guy in his car. Every department's gonna be different. The next suburb over could have some racist chief or something like that, whereas where this guy sleeps might just have some.
Well, it does. It depends on the cops and it depends on the administration. Because you talk about here and see, I wouldn't say what I am, but these guys over here by the express, that's a crew. And that's a business. Then I don't know. I mean, there's some in there that I'm sure are actually needy, homeless, but there are others over there they're working. And my big question is, why is it? Is it because they have selected Lansing Township, where the police have a different? They just let them go. I'd like to have something done, because I don't believe they're homeless. I believe they're just running game.
And that's one of the problems about the misunderstanding of homelessness is that you're right. I think a lot of the public views them as homeless when in fact many of them aren't. Many of them in proximity live by the tent city. That's off of the Riverwalk. So I know a lot of them live there. But from what was told to me by numerous people, those beggars are the heroin addicts. And they are, a little bit less of a beneficial cog to the system. They're not needy unless their needs are for drugs. But having said that, I don't necessarily think the anti-begging policies that were instituted in Flint, for example, solve that problem. Like you said, why are they here? What if there's an anti-begging ordinance that goes in here? They'll just go to Oakland's. They'll just go somewhere else.
It's not addressing the issue. I agree.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that there's some guys that just like here. They just like pimp city.
That is it. That is from city. That those who you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay, I'm cool.
One of the things, again, just clarification questions. You talked about using grounded theory.
Yeah.
And the question is, okay, so you grounded theory is this notion that it's going to arise out of the data, and this is very rich in data, and it seems like your theory in the end is structures matter, but we already know that.
Yeah.
Right. So what would you say is your or maybe not your theoretical contribution at this point, because of, as I read this, Wolcott talked about you can be, with qualitative data or any data, qualitative data, you can be descriptive, analytical, or interpretive. And it seems like this was much more descriptive than analytical or interpretive. And none of them is better. But theoretically, if we already know structures matter, what are you heading towards, or what would you like to, besides I want to change things?
Yeah, I would say that I'm trying to contribute to more emphasis and exposure of that, because we might know that, I'm not sure everyone else knows that outside this room.
Well, that's the idea of public sociology.
Yeah, and this is what,
That was my earlier question of what sociology is supposed to do besides study.
expose the problem for what it really is. So like, one of the things that I liked was when I go talk to a subject, I tell them what I was doing, and I tell them what my qualitative research is in my embedded ethnography, and I'd say, this is what I want to know, and they would respond, oh, so you want to know what's really going on. And so that's what I'm trying to expose, what's really going on. And I would say it is descriptive. I think the quantitative data is even further down that, descriptive.
So it describes something else.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that was the qualitative stuff. I just, again, not that I should or shouldn't. I didn't see a lot of analysis where you say here are patterns that are emerging, and so on. And part of it was, it was a smaller sample, which again is fine, very rich data. And so I just and the other thing with Goffman, and not that Goffman should or shouldn't be in here, but I first had this notion that this notion of homeless identity is placed upon them. And that then you get the sense of reading some of these people that they're making an effort to provide a certain kind of, I'm the rough sleeper on the shelter. I mean, they are making choices within a very limited amount. Then I started thinking, maybe not. Maybe they're not thinking about who I really want to be. They're doing what they can do, and they're not thinking of identity.
I think that's a great way of putting it. I think that has been the most, for me, most awakening point for me. It is that I realized suddenly that I'm judging people, even though I say I'm not. But I'm looking at, and I'm very arrogant. And I'm like,
Well, we're professors. We're encouraged to, we have this system for classifying. We learn these theories.
And this is one of the struggles for me was I wanted to come up with typologies and themes and patterns, and at the end of 450 pages, I didn't have any.
Well, I mean, from my scene, Toby was asking about it, and I think really the most unique thing about this is your experiential work. You're taking a role, and like you were asking about, starting out with the Goffman, if you looked at it from an institutional perspective, then you could have had the Goffman. What is the religious shelter? What is the police? What is the different municipalities? What's the city council? What the federal agencies? They would all have different definitions. And that's much more aligned with Goffman. And then on the other hand, your experience, you see people, they have different lifestyles, different concerns, and you can, come up with a folk theory about that. But, when you were doing the role play, that was happening to you too. You started just focusing on like what food you could tolerate and what you couldn't. The coffee was better. You couldn't tolerate the beef or whatever. Yeah, and just killing time. Just what am I going to do for the next 7 hours? And so really the whole role was kind of taking you over and putting you into that, disempowered, dependent survival, and you were even saying like, it would be good to drink. That'll help me, make me warm and kill the next 6 hours. And so, and that's, people that are faced with those difficulties, what they call self-medication. So I think that's really powerful. I think, this could either, I wouldn't ask you to revise this, but I think you should think this before. The whole idea of, sociologists, but also writers, to, taking the role, doing this role-playing thing. And in some cases, some people, postmodernists or whatever would see it's oppressive because it's hard. You have this nice condo, but you're pretending to be homeless. But at the same time, there's the classic Jorge Bustamante, where the Latino graduate student is the undocumented immigrant, the Los Mojados wetback story. There's Harper's stuff about being on Skid Row. There's and like now, if you look in some of the journals, like in qualitative sociology, and other things, that I guess there's with people that act like sex, they take the role of sex workers, they either work with them or actually do it themselves. There was this one article in qualitative sociology where, I don't know if the person was in it already, but it was some kind of like, subculture where people hit each other, for like a masochist subculture. And so I think that's an interesting and important tradition. A lot of, sure, we know about structure, but it's kind of, we always need to relearn it, because everything, there's always these alternative ideologies. And I think that, for teaching, for learning, for the experiential, for Waquan, where he becomes the Golden Gloves boxer, that's an important tradition that's part of learning and teaching and empathy, and that it could be flawed. The person, Harper, goes on the fruit tramp and he hides his Leica, while he's doing it, and then he goes and then he leaves that role. But I think that's an important aspect of the human experience, and people are always interested in that. It's influenced writers. It's an awareness kind of thing. It's kind of why they have study abroad, or a whole series of other kinds of experiences. Different hierarchies, where they the pledges have to do certain kind of humiliating things before they get the rites of passage. It's almost universal. And I think I guess there's like in medical sociology, there's like, you learn certain procedures by having them done to you, and then you doing to your colleague. I don't know if they still do that, but I think that's a really interesting thing that you've developed, and that took a lot of fortitude and gave you a lot of insight, and that's a valuable learning experience. That basic knowledge that you have is, it's a different kind of knowledge than just reading Foucault or Habermas or something like that.
My interest, or what I would like you to think about, and maybe you already have, is the whole notion of roles really doesn't fit this group. They're not. The functionalists can talk about their role is, or the Marxists can talk about their role is, and we can come up with their role is, but as they play out their lives, do they see themselves as playing a role? Do they have an identity in the sense that we think of their identity? Or is it a matter of, again, Goffman stuff doesn't fit because there's not a typification. There's not, this backstage, front stage. Seems like it's all front stage.
Yeah.
Maybe in a rare exception, they might be able to justify themselves, but not very much.
And this isn't judging. It's not saying, oh, you don't have a role, so you're not productive, and we don't need you. It's like all this sociology we do, does it stop at some point?
Yeah.
One other question I had about it is this is more just methodological or editing, but a lot of times you describe people by their race.
Yeah.
And that, obviously race is part of it, but unless it, on the other hand, you're not supposed to, it's not polite or conventional to say, okay, here comes look, what's that Asian guy?
Yeah. I know what you're saying, because the race had no bearing on.
Yeah, if it's relevant, it's like, okay, here I'm at the homeless shelter and everyone there is African American. Yeah. That's data. But if okay, there's a guy strumming the guitar over there, and what his race is. Yeah. So just the labeling thing, insofar as you're going to send it to University Microfilm, and it's going to be available. Do you want to come up with another, moniker, another pseudonym?
Yeah.
Because just, that's a shorthand, but you know, it's kind of insidious and, you know, we're kind of encouraged not to use it.
Yeah, I considered that, and I'm still considering it in my head, because it did not have play any role into the description.
I mean, it could be very, you know, segregation and, you know, all these kinds of things, racialization are very relevant, and, you know, different kinds of privilege, or, you know, I mean, kind of like the Hardigan thing, you know, what happens, you know, what's the role of a white person in a black majority city?
You know, I left it in for two reasons. One was to be descriptive. I
Mhm.
wanted it to be as robustly descriptive as possible. And two is, I didn't come to any conclusion based on race, but my thought was always, if I went back
Mhm.
and even coded all of these people by race and sort of saw how each code, maybe I could produce some theme out of it that I don't have right now. So those are two reasons why I left it in there. But
I mean, I would say if you really want to do something with it, that's fine. You know, you've created this huge body of work, and that you're probably going to want to do it. And like my suggestion is, you could write an article about, you know, like for qualitative sociology or sociological methodology, about, you know, the sociologist as role players, you know, taking the role of the other, or whatever you want to do. I think that would be great. There's a lot of things in here, and certainly, you know, the racial factors, recontextualizing with that lens would be good. But I would argue that if possible, to avoid using, unless they were specifically relevant, you know, racial categorizations of people is, you know,
not helpful.
yeah, and it's even, I mean, it's like, because if, you know, a lot of people are identified as black, then then it becomes like, you know, being non-black becomes relevant, and what is, people ask, well, what's the relevance of it? You know, and we do, you know, when you're like, you know, you haven't eaten in 9 hours and you're freezing, you know, you might not think of the most imaginative, you know, code word, but I think insofar as it's a public document and people will be looking at it and evaluating, you know, it maybe looking at it, you know, for giving you positions or publication, something like that. You might want to think about, you know, that might be a certain revision that would be worthwhile.
Yeah.
Just in a few other things. I mean, some parts were a little, you know, the background is, I appreciate, but, you know, it is long.
Yeah.
Some parts are a little bit, you know, difficult. In terms of, you know, they could be boiled down, you know, so if it wasn't necessary. And you said kind of the thing about, you know, the qualitative versus quantitative, you said that like maybe 12 times or something like that. I mean, it's an important issue, and in a long document you want to restate it, but, you know, you don't want to overstate that.
I have to be on my lectures, but I have to say the same
Well,
thing.
yeah, I mean, maybe in a verbal, you know, verbally repeating things is supposed to, you know, can be a verbal style. But those are just some of the things. In general, I think there was a few you know, I can give you this, you know, it's not too extreme, but there's a few editing I think you did generally good. Another question is the idea of civilian. Because, I mean, obviously there's the military and the civilian, and like The Sopranos, civilians are those who are not, you know, in the mafia, or not, you know, but, I mean, traditionally, civilian is contrasted with the military. And so does that mean, you know, homeless, quote, and whatever you want to call it, are in the military? I mean, maybe, you know, you could say, you know, non-homeless or average citizen or something like that. Or, you know, if you want to explain it, maybe, I mean, if people in the community use that terminology, then that's fine. You could just have a footnote about that.
Yeah, because if you're saying civilians, it means they're not.
Yeah.
And maybe that is what they say or how they feel. But
No, it was chosen because, like Steve said, it was somebody who's not military or somebody who's not mafia. So I was trying to just describe it and define it as a group that's not homeless.
I mean, sometimes, you know, they used to say, like, like straights, they used to say that like in the 60s, people that weren't part of some kind of counterculture, people that didn't take drugs, or I mean, there's also the gay straight, idea. But in terms the civilian, I get what you're saying, but it might not have the actual, because I mean, the whole idea that homeless people are kind of like a criminal underclass, I think that's a little bit too close to comfort, because probably a lot of people think that.
I'm gonna send you their mind, well, their minor. I was struck by the page 45 where you, something I noticed
economy, the difference between a place like Detroit and Ann Arbor is quite a bit different. There's another slide that's going to mention some of the ways that it's different, just basically. And also, Michigan political landscape is it's not totally unique, but it's unique in the fact that if you look at the districts and you see all the Republican legislators in more rural areas, and then you have the concentrated Democrat urban legislators. And then what I found was when I look at an anti-squatting bill, the anti-squatting bill would be proposed by a suburban legislator. There's not too much squatting in the suburbs as there would be in Detroit. So the anti-squatting legislation may come out of legislators who represent a constituency of the slumlords and the landowners, which then would harm the constituency in Detroit who votes against anti-squatting bills, which are the areas where the actual squatters live. And so you see that play out in Michigan time and time again with the way that the districts are rural and urban. And it's frustrating to see, for example, an anti-squatting bill come out of a rural county or be supported by a rural legislator as if that has real impact on their district. But other ways that Republican legislators have affected the homeless community is at the bottom. Engler closed all the, well, not all of them, but most of the psychiatric hospitals in the late 90s. So the brief history of homelessness, I didn't do too much antebellum stuff. Prior to the Civil War, I just didn't go into detail there. I started looking at homelessness after the Civil War because, in my view, that's where it started to get what you might call the current phenomenon of homelessness. After the Civil War, you have freed slaves and vagrant soldiers, vagrant soldier camps. This is, in fact, where the term hobo might actually come from, although nobody knows the specific place it came from. If you have, like, ho boys, and you shorten it to hobo, or if you have homeward bound, some soldier that's going back to his home, he's homeward bound. If you shorten both of those phrases, you could get hobo. So after the Civil War, you had the freed slaves and the soldiers in their camps. And then after the Civil War, the railroads were built, the depots were built around Lansing, for example, right around the turn of the century. At that time, the economies in places like Bay City and Flint were trading posts or logging communities, and that's where Skid Row comes from. A logging community would have a road where the logs skidded down, so they used to be called Skid Road, the skidding being the logs skidding. Bay City had a Hell's Half Mile fact that homelessness is dropping. In 2007, it was counted 651,000 homeless individuals, and in 2014, there was 578,000 homeless individuals. It's been constantly dropping, except for an uptick in 2010. And so, if it's dropping, and if communities like Washtenaw County are saying that they've solved homelessness and we're at functional zero, why should we even look at it as a problem? I hear news stories in Utah that they're solving the problem, they're housing everyone. And so they can say that homelessness is dropping, they being the agencies, the nonprofits, governmental institutions, and the media. And they can count the dropping homeless rates, but that doesn't really encompass the entire problem. The poverty is increasing, inequality is growing. Some graphs and charts that I show in the dissertation that support this in chapter 1. Also, there's some misunderstanding about the lives of the homeless and the lives of beggars. Sometimes beggars aren't homeless, sometimes homeless don't beg. In fact, I read a news story today in The Guardian about New York City, and New York City has the highest number of homeless, concentrated homeless individuals in the nation. And the stat in the article today from The Guardian was 30% of the homeless in New York City are employed. So 30% of the homeless in New York City have jobs. So there's a misunderstanding that these are lazy, non-working individuals. And there are laws that harm these individuals. I'm assuming that the 30% meant real jobs, if you consider leaving fast food a real job, or legitimate legal work. So that's 30%. I'm assuming that there are individuals in New York City, like there are where I did research in Detroit, who are scrapping, begging, prostitution, drug sales. So I would consider those to be working individuals, which would make the 30% even higher. In other words, not necessarily real lazy people out there. The laws that harm those individuals are laws against scrapping, laws against begging, public nuisance, anti-loitering, and anti-squatting laws. So I argue in the introduction that we need to go further than a quantitative explanation, and we need to understand more about the lives and these other factors here. In chapter 1, I talk about 3 sensitizing questions. I don't start with hypotheses and try to support or negate them, especially with quantitative data. I don't do that. These sensitizing questions are normal for qualitative research. So homeless people at that time were more train riding from logging camp to logging camp seeking work. At the turn of the century in Detroit, for example, you have a lot of charities and across the state, county poorhouses springing up. Then the Great Depression makes everyone poor. After the Great Depression, New Deal, Fair Housing Act, things like that, work becomes available, housing is more available, so you could work or be housed if you wanted to. The hobos and tramps and rail riders at that time, we might consider that more by choice. Choosing to work a certain way from town to town, transportation a certain way, riding the rails. But then in Detroit especially, in the 1960s, we have systemic urban renewal where highways mostly displace residents. And there's a slide, I think it's the next slide, that's going to show that pretty clearly, how that affected extremely poor people. It didn't necessarily create the phenomenon of homelessness, but it did not help entire communities. It really destroyed, literally, entire communities. And so not all of those community members instantly became homeless. Some of them did. But to impact a community so negatively like that, I would argue has long-lasting effects. In the 1980s, you have winos of the 60s and 70s turning into more recession era, out of work guys. There's some pictures in the dissertation that show that. And then at the end of the 90s, that's when the psychiatric hospitals closed. And the guy who closed them is actually now the director of community health, I think. So he's still doing his work. So that hasn't gone away. So the point with that especially is also with the rest of these points, none of these things really went away. I mean, the logging lumber town of Bay City, the economy has changed there. It's more of a down place. But these things, the impact of urban renewal has not gone away. And the impact of closing the psychiatric hospitals has not gone away. So there's a historical context that's still relevant to it. So this is a map that's not in the dissertation, but the list of these charities is. It's, I think, in page 87. What I did was map out these charities that existed in downtown Detroit in 1904 to give a little bit of a visual representation of the displacement and the movement of homeless services. In 1904, there were literally dozens of charities downtown. One of the sad things is anytime I do a street view of these, it's either an office building, an abandoned building, or a casino. And then in 1904, all right, recorder's going. This may be all we get. That's fine. I saw some students taking their exams downstairs, and there was a countdown clock. So maybe when that expires to 0, they'll all run up here and join us. I felt sympathetic for them because I don't remember seeing the countdown clock so blatantly presented on the front screen like they're dealing with on the first floor. This is my dissertation defense, Redefining the Homeless Experience in Michigan. I have 20 slides, planning about 2 minutes per slide, 40 minutes total. There's one pause, for questions, if you'd like to ask them at that time. The way I divided it up in half was chapters 1 through 4, background of the problem, history, and methodology, and then there's a split into my data and the good stuff. So if you want to ask questions about the first half, feel free to do that at the halfway point, or if you want to just save them to them, that's fine as well. There are 3 links to the slide deck, the proposal, and the dissertation. There, all the stuff's available. The bibliography is in the dissertation, so I don't cite them too in depth on the slideshow. The PowerPoint templates for Michigan State. The images, the pictures are all mine, unless it's an icon, then it's from open clip art, and I use that with permission. They're shareable. So this, the first picture here shows two passersby not paying attention to the beggar there. And it kind of sets the stage for why I'm doing this research, which is the existence of a social problem and the perspective that the public, some of the legislators, and some of the just general civilians have is a little bit different than maybe the reality is. So I wanted to get at more what the real life experience of the homeless individuals was. And so that's why I did my study. The table of contents for my dissertation are these 8 chapters, the basic chapters of intro, background, theory, methods. Then chapters 5 through 7 is me conducting the methods and gathering data and looking for themes. And the conclusion's rather brief. 2 pictures here from a college town. I saw that same crate last week, and last time I saw the guy that holds that sign was about 3 weeks ago. So even though this is a 3-year-long study, I still see some of the participants. And some things have changed and some haven't. Some have received housing and some are still in the same places as they were 3 years ago. Introduction chapter, we start with this pretty clear quantitative that guide the research as opposed to providing a platform to prove or disprove. So I start with these 3. How do the structural forces contribute to the variability of homeless experiences? Because homeless experiences did vary quite a bit in my study. What are the coping strategies? Which also relates to question 1, structures that influence the variability of coping strategies. And number 3, how is the homeless identity socially constructed? I did that last as I emailed Toby earlier this week. I did that 3rd question. I was intending to get more into the surveying the public and interviewing the public, civilians and citizens, about their views of homeless people and how they construct the identity of homeless individuals. There's a little bit of that in the Can-Man portion, and I did one survey. I would have liked to go more in depth on that. So my socially constructed identity research includes that, but it's not as much of the public understanding as I would like. I build a lot of my social construction of identity that response to that question more through my ethnography and my actual participation in the group in interviews with the homeless themselves. So they, in fact, contribute to the construction of their social identity. And I talk a little bit about described versus enacted identities in the dissertation. Just a side note, this is not so scientific, but I thought it was interesting that I talk about sensitizing questions that guide the research and tell me where to look. And I didn't intend to do this, but then I put this picture up here, and it was my picture where they're not looking at the homeless individual. It's almost like he's an invisible character here. And so the sensitizing questions that guide me where to look, it could guide those people where to look too. That's just a side note I thought was coincidental in my use of this picture. Chapter 2, background of the problem. I did research in Michigan mostly as a convenience sample. I did research in heterogeneous city, meaning government, industry, and academia in that city, and a college town, predominantly a college town, and also a deindustrialized large city in Michigan, mostly because that's where I worked and went to school and spent my free time on weekends. So there's a lot of convenience built into that sample, but there are 3 main factors that bit here about the uniqueness of Michigan. And the climate varies quite a bit. So when I would see a tent city in the summer, it would be different than seeing the same tent city in the winter. The coping strategies of seeking shelter maybe in a warming center versus sleeping outside. There's a variability of climate, which a place like Los Angeles doesn't have as much. There's a starkly variable